Urschel, who is the executive director of the museum and who is the final arbiter, not so much of what goes in the museum, but what we don't have room for. So if it's not in the museum, blame it on Joe Urschel. Joe's going to run our program tonight. Joe?
Thank you, Charles. I always like to put my watch up here on the podium before I start because I find that it gives the audience hope. I stole that line from Arlen Specter, I have to admit. It's funnier when he says it. Anyone who has ever worked in a newsroom knows the importance of the AP. Not only does it bring you the big stories and the daily updates from around the world and even from space, but it also provides a lot of help getting those late election returns into your very last edition. It doesn't just cover the world in all of its complexities and trivialities. It also provides great comfort. How many times has an anxious editor, looking skeptically at his own reporter, trying to decide whether to go to press with a story, looked up nervously and asked, "Well, what does the AP say?" And then if those two reports are in some degree of compliance, he can courageously decide to run it. Such is the accuracy and reputation of the Associated Press. Tonight we're going to get a chance to hear some of the stories behind the stories from a few of the people who were on hand when history happened. And there's a little right there. The people who broke the news to the nation and broke the glasses on the dais. Let me introduce our distinguished panel while they're getting mic'd up. Walter Mears is a Pulitzer Prize-winning political correspondent for AP. During his 45 years with the AP, he also served as the Washington bureau chief, executive editor, vice president, and columnist. His memoir, Deadlines Past, was published in 2003. Katherine Johnson, as you saw in the video, is a former Atlanta reporter for AP and figures prominently in the book's Civil Rights chapter, chronicling her work. Darrell Christian has served as sports editor, managing editor, and business editor in his 30-plus years with the AP. Currently, he is an editor-at-large. Ron Edmonds is AP's senior White House photographer. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his photographic series that captured the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. George Esper was a longtime Saigon bureau chief for the AP. As the North Vietnamese took over Saigon, George Esper and Peter Arnett stayed behind to file stories on the city's fall. George is the author of The Eyewitness History of the Vietnam War, a recollection of soldiers during the war. And now we'll get started as soon as everyone's finished. I guess we're all set. Please remember to turn off your cell phones or forward them to mine. We will be taking questions later in the program from the audience, so please try to think up some really tough ones, because I'm going to ask the easy ones. We have some wonderful photographs from the AP's history, as Charles talked about, and I'd like to start out by looking at one series of photographs, the photographs that won the Pulitzer Prize for our panelists tonight. And let's start with slide number 10 of the Reagan series. There it is. Ron, can you walk us through these pictures and kind of tell us how you got to where you were, how you got the shot, and what you were thinking while you took it?
Well, I was traveling in the motorcade with the president. The Associated Press has a photographer and reporter with the president at all times, and we had been to the Hilton Hotel. He spoke to a union group, and we traveled in those days. We traveled in a car that was 2 cars back. Now we travel, I think it's about 20 cars back, so it's a little more difficult. I'm not so sure if it's for safety or to keep the reporters from the president to get his comments, but we had just come outside, and at that time it was normal to stand right next to the driver of the limousine. We'd stand there because the president would usually walk out and wave across the street. It was a good vantage point, and he walked out and waved just like a normal wave, and that's when the shots rang out, and they fired the shots. I think the Secret Service said something like 1.9 seconds. He fired 6 shots, and with the camera I was shooting with, I saw him grimace. I actually didn't know it was the shots at first. It sounded, it was a very small caliber gun. It sounded like firecrackers, but he kind of hunkered down, and so I pushed the shutter on the camera. And to give you an idea of how quick that particular moment was, in those 1.9 seconds, I was shooting a camera that shot 6 frames a second. There's only 3 frames that have the president's head visible. And so unfortunately for my competitor that day, he either looked to the right or looked to the left, trying to see where the shots came from, and did not have that sequence. And then that's when, you know, the world kind of came unglued, and people yelling, screaming, and there was a woman across the street whose husband she thought was on the detail, and in the sound you can hear her screaming, my husband, but it turned out her husband wasn't on the detail that day. And probably one of the biggest things for me that day was the motorcade took off immediately, and one of my things that's built into an AP photographer covering the White House is you always stay with the president. And to this day I'm thankful that the motorcade took off and didn't even stop for us, because I would have had to make that decision that moment, and I probably would have gotten in the van because my job was to stay with the president, and we would have only gone 3 or 4 blocks because they realized at that point that the president had been shot, and the limousine broke off, and I'd have been in the van just driving back to the White House. So fortunately for me, it left me, and I was able to do the pictures of the victims on the ground. And one of the things, we spend a lot of time at the White House and building a rapport with both security people and the White House personnel. I was fairly familiar with most of the agents on it, and so from the pictures where you see that I'm out where the people in the background are laying on the ground, the agents pretty much left me alone because they knew who I was.
You're being very politic. I mean, before when we were talking before the program started, you said it's a good thing you were there because you didn't want to have to go back and explain to Walter why you didn't have the pictures.
Well, I actually going back to the White House, Frank Johnson of the Washington Post photographer gave me a ride back to the White House, and the whole way back there, I said, I'm in trouble because I never saw Hinckley's face, and I know Walter's going to say they wrestled with him for an hour there. Couldn't you have gotten a picture of it? Fortunately for me, Walter was very good about it. Walter hired me, and it was actually my second day on the White House for the Associated Press, and I had just come to work for him, and I was on probation, and Hal Buell, who was head of pictures at the time, called me and said, you know, great job. He said, you're still on probation, but I think we're going to lift your probation. I think you got the job with him. But we didn't know at the scene until we got back to the White House that the president had actually been shot. In fact, their representatives on the scene said he hadn't been hit. And so when I got back to the White House, I was going through the security at the front gate, and I was talking to one of the agents there, and I said, you know, the president's been shot. He said, the president's been shot. And I said, no, they missed him. He said, no, he's at the hospital. And of course, now my heart is dying because I should have gone to the hospital. But fortunately, I went inside just in time to have Al Haig walk out and tell us that he was in charge. So I kind of had both ends of the story there.
Now, Walter, you had a front row seat to the American presidential campaigns from 1960 to the year 2000.